New York correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, who joins us now, actually, and we'll catch up a little bit more on this story. Sherwin, this is a very welcome development for sure, not just for Ukraine, but the rest of the world, particularly here on the continent.
Well, some additional breaking news at this hour, Peter. The Wall Street Journal reporting that wheat trading on the Chicago Board of Trade, essentially an exchange, a future and options exchange focused on the trading of agricultural products, is now trading wheat, that is wheat futures. A contract fell 5.9% to $7.59. So we are seeing already an immediate drop in those wheat future prices, which will then have a ripple effect around the globe. So we are seeing immediate relief here. But of course, this is a deal that now needs implementation. Implementation is going to be key here, but certainly a lot of optimism, a lot of hope expressed by certainly among senior UN officials, no less the Secretary General. This is what else he had to say. Let's watch.
This agreement did not come easy. Since the war started, I've been highlighting that there is no solution to the global food crisis without ensuring full global access to Ukraine's food products and Russian food and fertilizers. Today, we took important steps to achieve this objective, but it has been a long road. In April, after being received by President Erdogan, I met with President Putin and President Zelensky to propose a plan for solutions, and we have been working every day since. It took immense efforts and commitment by all sides and weeks of around-the-clock negotiations. The commitment and dedication are even more vital today.
So, Peter, to clarify, this is a package deal. Essentially, two deals were signed and penned in Istanbul earlier today. The first part of the deal is where senior representatives from Ukraine, the Russian Federation, Turkey, and the United Nations, which essentially facilitated and spearheaded this initiative, signed a deal that establishes a mechanism for the safe transportation of grain, related foodstuffs, things like sunflower seeds, sunflower oil, that kind of thing, and fertilizer from Ukrainian ports to the global markets. The second part of that deal is an agreement reached between the United Nations and the Russian Federation on the scope of engagement of the UN to facilitate the unimpeded export to world markets of Russian food and fertilizer, including the raw materials required to produce fertilizer. So there are two tranches to this deal, but given the fact that Ukraine and Russia are now viewed as bread baskets for the world, this is an important step forward. But of course, implementation now, the implementation of these technical details that were agreed to in Istanbul today is now going to be key in terms of alleviating the burgeoning international food crisis that we've now been reporting on for months.
All right, so this deal, this agreement, 120 days, I believe, it's signed for. Is that going to be long enough to clear this backlog? And then do we know what happens after 120 days?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's the first 120 days. And if, of course, there's a peace deal within that period, Peter, the renewal of this deal won't be necessary, right? So this is the first few months of the deal. And the expectation is that if this war, as most expect, is still continuing after those 120 days, the parties then will extend the deal. That certainly is the indication. You know, we've heard from the UK ambassador, a member of certainly the Western Alliance against Russia, but we haven't heard from the Russians in terms of what they think and feel about this deal. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, spoke earlier. This is what he said.
Рассчитываем, что в предстоящий период
We hope that in the coming period, all of the necessary efforts will be made for the effective implementation of these agreements. Of no small importance in this regard is the conscientious assistance of the UN and the constructive approach of the international community as a whole, including Western countries. Given the significant share of Russian and Ukrainian agricultural products on global markets, ensuring their uninterrupted export needs the urgent tasks of maintaining food security, especially for developing and least developed countries. All of this should contribute to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, including the eradication of hunger.
But of course, an important peg of this deal is what is now called the Joint Coordination Center. Essentially, it is going to be made up of teams from Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, and the United Nations based in Istanbul, which will be this transit area from the Black Sea to the world markets. These teams will then inspect the cargo on these ships to make sure that there's no proliferation of weapons or weapon smuggling and that sort of thing, to ensure that it's just food exports and fertilizer. And this new center, Peter, will monitor the movement of commercial vessels to ensure compliance with this initiative. Remember, we're not talking about military vessels here. We're talking about commercial vessels transporting this grain in a very, very complicated military or militarized environment. So, when we talk about commercial entities like this, there are issues of insurance companies, that are going to insure these vessels on the high seas, want assurances that these vessels will get safe passage. So these are the details that are very, very important in terms of this monitoring mechanism. Focus on export of bulk commercial grain and related food commodities only, so they will be looking only at that criteria. And this center will also ensure the on-site control and monitoring of cargo from Ukrainian ports and report on shipments facilitated through this initiative. So, this is an all-hands-on-deck initiative. All these parts need to come together to ensure that, the 20 million tons of grain that is stuck in Ukrainian ports, we're told stuck on ships and in silos for months now, Peter. This is an initiative to get that grain released onto world markets so that we can deal with issues like the famine that is now expanding in places like the Horn of Africa region, Peter.
All right, so that's Ukraine output. What about Russian fertilizers and foods? Because they've been hit by sanctions. Has their door opened for them as well?
Yeah, so the second part of that deal is for the UN to provide assurances that Russian exports from ports also in the Black Sea will be able to reach world markets. But Peter, this is again a situation where he said, right? In terms of Russia and the West. Russia says sanctions are hurting their exports. Western nations argue that the sanctions are very targeted and are not on any food and fertilizer. So they say the argument, certainly from countries like the United States and the UK, is that the sanctions should not impede Russia's ability to bring its produce, its fertilizer and food, its wheat to the markets. Russia says that's not the case. This is going to be one of those scenarios where people will believe who they believe. But the one side that has imposed the sanctions here says they have not targeted Russia's exports of food and fertilizer. In fact, Ambassador James O'Brien is doing the rounds in New York here at the United Nations today. He is the head of the United States State Department's Office of Sanctions. He's the coordinator of that office, and he says that they are here to explain to countries that their sanctions are not impeding those products, food and fertilizer, from reaching the markets, be that Ukraine or Russia. They believe that Russia has blockaded the Black Sea and that has prevented Ukraine's grain certainly from reaching markets. And hopefully now this deal opens up a path forward so that we can see some relief in terms of the prices of grain and certainly get that to the places that need them the most, Peter.
The Americans saying cautious optimism required here. And I suppose in the end, Russia is the key enabler of all of this. They hold the key to make sure that this deal works.
And in many ways, Russia also holds the key to whether we get a long-term peace deal here. What this deal shows us is that compromise is possible when you have the right stakeholders and facilitators in the room. Turkey, of course, playing a very important role here. Maybe this opens up a future role for Turkey in terms of a broader deal. The United Nations stepping up into its role here. There's been a lot of criticism directed at the UN for not doing enough, particularly particularly the UN Security Council. The Secretary General telling a number of people in this building, Peter, that he believes this deal is one of his biggest achievements since assuming the helm of the United Nations almost 6 years ago. So there is certainly a lot of hope in here. But in terms of a longer term, in terms of the implementation of this deal, but also where we go in terms of this conflict, this 5-month-old conflict, very much rests in the hands of President Vladimir Putin and certainly the people that he has surrounded himself with. Only President Putin really knows where we go from here in terms of whether this deal will be implemented and certainly whether we get a peace deal. That, of course, is also true for President Zelensky in Ukraine. So let's be clear on that too, Peter.
All right, Sherwin, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much indeed. Always great getting updates from you. All right, that's Sherwin Bryce-Pease, our New York correspondent, giving us an update on this significant deal that's been signed with Ukraine and Russia to unlock the Black Sea ports to make sure that the grain that's been blockaded for months now starts to leave and reach us here on the continent and other parts of the world. And hopefully we'll start to see those grain prices drop, and that might even have a knock-on effect on inflation, because we got 0.75% hike, didn't we, recently on our interest rates. All right, let's keep our fingers crossed. Stay with us. Still lots more to come after this. We go to Les Sud.